Hey guys, tonight we are going to pull back the curtain on the most terrifying truth about the death of a king. We will step inside the chamber of Edward VI during his final weeks, a room where, according to witnesses, no one could bear the thick, suffocating heat and the sour, acrid smell. This is not just a history story. This is a psychological study of how absolute pressure consumed a human being. Edward VI was no ordinary boy. He was the child raised to become the symbol of divine salvation, a king trained to believe that his will was God's will. From birth, he was isolated from normal emotions and everyday interactions. Every smile, every nod of his was converted into duty, responsibility, and destiny. The result was a 15-year-old ruler with the rigidity of a dictator and an unshakable belief in his own righteousness. But as his reign stood at the peak of its religious absolutism, strange noises began to echo from his sickbed. A wet, rattling, struggling breath, the sound of a body collapsing. Tonight, we will examine the most horrific conflict, when iron conviction in absolute power meets the physical limits of flesh and blood. What happens when you believe you cannot be wrong, but your own lungs begin to betray you? This is the story of how a great reformer was strangled and suffocated to death by his own room, and why that death haunts those who witnessed it even to this day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as usual, let me know where you are watching from and what your local time is right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the final weeks of the life of Edward VI, people whispered that no one could bear to remain in the king's chamber for more than a fleeting moment. The air inside had thickened into something heavy and suffocating, a slow-moving heat that clung to the skin like damp cloth, carrying with it the sharp, unmistakable smell of illness. Even the most seasoned courtiers, men and women who had witnessed war, plague, and executions, found themselves involuntarily stepping back the moment they crossed the threshold. Servants murmured to one another about the strange, wet rattle rising from the royal bed, a sound so eerie and so intimate that it followed them down the corridor long after they had slipped out of the room. They said it clung to the ears like a ghost, a reminder that something inside that chamber was quietly unraveling. Everyone understood, though no one dared say it aloud, that behind that closed door, a truth far more disturbing was unfolding, a truth the crown had no intention of letting the country see. And to understand why the end of Edward came in such a painful, suffocating, almost haunting way, one must drift backward, slowly, gently, as if floating down a dim corridor of memory, to the moment this boy first entered the world. Edward VI lives in the public imagination as a pale, fragile child who ruled England briefly before slipping away at the age of 15. But that simple image hides something far sharper. He was a boy shaped deliberately, intensely, more aggressively than any Tudor heir before him. His short reign, his collapse, and the eerie stillness of his final days cannot be understood without returning to the roots of the life that produced him far before he wore a crown, far before he spoke, even before he gained the first awareness of himself. His story begins in a country worn thin by more than 2 decades of political and religious turmoil. England, by the time he was born, was exhausted, not just tired, but spiritually frayed, stretched to its limits by the endless reshaping of church and state, by executions ordered in the name of stability, by fear disguised as righteousness. The land was desperate for something, anything that resembled certainty. And because adults often reach for the most fragile symbols when they feel most vulnerable, they began building their hopes on the shoulders of an infant who had no idea what any of them expected of him. Edward entered the world in October of the year 1537, the long-awaited male child that Henry VIII had spent more than 20 years trying to produce. For over 2 decades, Henry's desire for a male heir had torn England through scandal, annulment, executions, and a religious rupture that reshaped the very bones of the kingdom. When Jane Seymour finally delivered a living son, relief thundered through the nation. Bells rang in villages and cities. Bonfires crackled across the countryside. Priests stood at their pulpits and proclaimed that God had forgiven England at last. But that joy lasted less than 2 weeks. When Jane died suddenly of childbed fever, the jubilation around the newborn prince curdled into dread. Everyone in the palace understood even if they never spoke of it, that the entire Tudor line now balanced on the body of a baby who could not lift his own head. A kingdom's future, after so many years of turmoil, now depended on the breath of an infant lying in a cradle. And so, from his very first moments, Edward lived inside a kind of sacred tension. His nursery was transformed into a heavily guarded sanctuary. Every movement he made was documented. Every sound he uttered was examined. Wet nurses were rotated constantly to ensure that none grew tired or careless. Physicians hovered over him as if watching over the kingdom itself, taking note of the rise and fall of his breathing, the temperature of his skin, the rhythm of his appetite. Nothing about his earliest years resembled what anyone would call a childhood. The adults around him moved through each day with the brittle expectation that disaster might arrive at any moment. He grew up in a world without spontaneous laughter, without relaxed gestures, without the warmth of ordinary family life. From his earliest days, he absorbed a single, inescapable lesson. His existence carried a weight far greater than anything his small body could understand. Edward was born in the quiet chill of October, in the year 1537, more than 2 decades after Henry VIII first began his relentless and consuming search for a male heir. For over 20 years, the king's obsession had carved deep wounds into England, years marked by executions that stained the scaffold with blood, by religious upheavals that tore the kingdom in half, and by a constant, restless fear that the Tudor line might crumble without a son to secure it. Every annulment, every accusation of treason, every shift in doctrine had unfolded beneath the shadow of that single longing. And then, at long last, Jane Seymour delivered a healthy prince. The relief that swept through the court was not the soft, gentle kind. It crashed over England like a wave. Church bells rang across cities and villages. Bonfires burned bright on cobbled streets. Priests stood before their congregations and proclaimed that God himself had forgiven the kingdom, that the storms of the past had finally broken open to reveal a clear sky. For a brief moment, the entire nation exhaled together. After more than 2 decades of uncertainty, England finally had what it believed it needed: a male heir, a symbol of continuity, a promise for the future. But that fragile peace lasted less than 2 weeks. Jane Seymour's sudden death, the quiet, sharp ending brought on by childbed fever, struck the palace like a cold hand pressing down on a flame. One moment the corridors were alive with celebration. The next, they felt haunted and hollow. The crib that had been surrounded by laughter, music, and whispered prayers turned into the center of a national dread. The joyous glow that had filled the air around the infant prince dimmed instantly, replaced by a heavy, unspoken fear. Every person within the palace walls understood, even if no one dared express it openly. The survival of the Tudor dynasty now rested entirely on a baby who could not yet lift his own head. The life of a kingdom, its security, its future, its very sense of purpose, had been placed upon the chest of a newborn sleeping beneath embroidered blankets. And because adults often fear what they cannot control, that fear began shaping the very air Edward breathed. It was this fear that formed the backdrop of the prince's earliest years, the quiet hum beneath every cradle song, the invisible presence lurking beside every smile. His nursery was quickly transformed into a tightly guarded sanctuary, a place where nothing happened by chance. Every movement he made, each stretch of his fingers, each turn of his head was watched carefully and written down as if it carried prophetic meaning. Servants walked with measured steps, their voices hushed, as though even the slightest disturbance might jeopardize the child on whom an entire realm depended. Midwives and wet nurses rotated constantly, shifted in and out with a precision more suited to soldiers on duty than to caretakers of a child. They were not allowed to grow tired, or familiar, or careless. Their work was not simply nurturing a baby, it was guarding the fragile thread of succession. Meanwhile, physicians hovered over Edward with the seriousness of men tending a sacred flame. They took note of the heat of his forehead, the rhythm of his breathing, the pattern of his appetite. If he cried too long, they recorded it. If he slept more deeply than usual, they questioned it. Nothing about him was trivial. Nothing was allowed to be ordinary. The deeper truth was simple and terribly heavy. This tiny child was not allowed to be just a child. He was the embodiment of a dynasty's hope, an anchor tied to the future of England after years of turbulence. And because of that, everything surrounding him tightened the rules, the routines, the worries, the expectations until his world resembled not a nursery, but a delicate glass chamber where every breath mattered. Inside that quiet room, wrapped in blankets and watched by eyes that never softened, Edward VI began his life under a weight he could not feel, could not name, and could never escape. A weight that had settled on him before he even opened his eyes. Nothing in the childhood of Edward VI ever resembled what one might call an ordinary childhood. The adults around him lived in a constant state of quiet dread, as though disaster might descend at any moment, and that tension shaped the air he breathed. In such an atmosphere, the gentle chaos of a real childhood spontaneous laughter, clumsy play, careless joy, simply could not exist. His world became still, controlled, softened at the edges, not with comfort but with fear. Those early years taught him one lesson above all others, that his mere existence carried a weight far heavier than anything his young mind could grasp. The direct presence of Henry VIII only intensified that pressure. Unlike his relationships with Mary and Elizabeth, which were tangled with punishment, suspicion, and shifting political storms, Henry treated Edward with a kind of unwavering adoration. The king visited the nursery often, lingering beside the cradle, speaking of his son as though the child were not simply a boy, but a symbol of atonement for an entire kingdom. Foreign diplomats, accustomed to the king's famous volatility, wrote that Henry seemed to soften, almost melt. Whenever he looked at Edward, a rare glimpse of tenderness, in a man who rarely allowed such softness to show. But within that affection lay a dangerous consequence. Edward was not merely loved, he was idolized. Every smile offered to him carried a shadow of expectation. Every gentle word held an echo of duty. Every touch whispered of destiny. The boy absorbed these things without understanding them, but they sank into him all the same. Long before he learned to speak in full sentences, he had already learned something deeper, that people approached him not with honesty, not with equality, but with a mixture of fear and hope, reverence and caution. He was not spoken to the way children are usually spoken to. He was spoken to as if he carried prophecy in his small, uncertain hands. Even at an age when most children are allowed to stumble, make noise, be messy, and be loved simply for being themselves, Edward was already being asked silently, constantly to be more. His identity was shaped not through discovery, but through projection. Adults looked at him and saw not a child learning to walk, but a future king whose steps carried the weight of a dynasty. They saw not a boy learning to speak, but a voice that one day would command a nation. And by seeing these things in him, they denied him the chance to become anything else. The result was a childhood without the sweetness of childhood. No equal companionship, no true friendships, no space to be ordinary. The people around him bowed too deeply, spoke too carefully, and watched him too closely. They were loyal to the idea of him, not to the boy himself. Even in his earliest days, Edward lived in a world where everyone wanted something from him. Reassurance, redemption, security, the promise of stability, and no one saw him simply as a small, breathing, vulnerable human being. From the very beginning, he was not allowed to be Edward the child. He was shaped into Edward the symbol, the answer to the fears of the adults who surrounded him. And in that quiet, heavy transformation, a true childhood slipped away before he ever had the chance to feel it. When Edward reached the age at which most children are allowed to wander, to question, to discover the world through curiosity rather than duty, his path was already fixed. Choosing his tutors was not a matter of simple education. It was an act of engineering. The court selected strict Protestant scholars, men of sharp conviction and rigid theology with one purpose only: to mould Edward into the king Henry VIII had dreamed into existence. A king who would be intelligent, disciplined, unwavering, and ready to defend the religious transformation that had reshaped England. Lessons began early each morning, sometimes before the sun had risen fully, and stretched through the long hours of the day like an unbroken thread. There was no room for wandering thoughts, no space for play, no breath of the natural world that usually widens a child's understanding. Instead, Edward lived in the narrow corridors of books and doctrine, a world built from ink and obligation. He studied languages, theology, law, but these subjects were never taught with softness or curiosity. Everything he absorbed came through texts, emphasizing conflict, divine justice, and the belief that power flowed downward from God to king, never upward from people to ruler. He learned that negotiation was weakness, that certainty was virtue, that obedience was the natural order of the world. The crown, in shaping his mind, left no room for doubt. This education would have been demanding even for an adult. For a child, it was all-consuming, and surrounding this rigid structure was an isolation, so complete it became the final instrument of shaping. Edward rarely played with other children, and on the rare occasions he did, those children were instructed to treat him with the same formality they would show at court. They were not companions. They were extensions of protocol. Even in moments meant to resemble play, the air remained taut. No one contradicted him. No one teased him. No one dared treat him as an equal. The few minutes of childhood allowed to him each week were hollow, staged, choreographed to protect his identity as a future monarch rather than nurture his identity as a growing boy. In this carefully arranged world, his personality developed the way a flame does inside a glass lantern protected from outside wind, contained, controlled, unable to spread naturally. His sense of self formed inside a vacuum, designed entirely by adults, who believed they were preparing him for a destiny too important to risk with spontaneity or ordinary experience. And when Edward finally grew old enough to articulate his own thoughts, the result was unsettling. His speech carried a maturity that did not match his age, a measured certainty that felt less like childhood learning and more like inherited doctrine. He spoke not as a boy discovering the world, but as someone already convinced of how the world should be. The people around him mistook this unnatural composure for brilliance. They saw a prodigy. They saw promise. They saw a child already wearing the outline of a king. But beneath that polished surface was something far more fragile, a mind shaped entirely by the ambitions of others, without the grounding warmth of ordinary experience, without the balance that comes from play, contradiction, or equal companionship. Edward had been taught what to believe, how to judge, how to command, but never how to be human. And so, long before he ascended the throne, he was already carrying himself with the firmness and rigidity of someone who had never been allowed the softness of being young. When Henry VIII died in the year 1547, and Edward ascended the throne at the age of 9, everything on the surface seemed deceptively smooth. The boy stepped into kingship without the slightest trace of confusion or fear, none of the trembling uncertainty one might expect from a child, suddenly handed the weight of a kingdom. To those watching from the outside, it appeared almost effortless, as if he had simply walked into the role that had been carved for him since the moment he first drew breath. The Regency Council believed they understood the task ahead. They would rule in his name, guide policies gently, shield him from the harsher edges of politics, and allow him to learn statecraft slowly, safely, at a manageable pace. What they did not understand, not then, not until it was too late, was that Edward had already internalized the expectations placed upon him so deeply that he no longer separated his personal will from the supposed needs of the realm. In his mind, there was no distinction between what he wanted and what England required. He did not see himself as a child learning to rule. He saw himself as the king England had waited for. This became clear almost immediately in the council chamber. Ministers quickly noticed two things about the young monarch. He absorbed information with astonishing speed, and he had almost no patience for anything resembling nuance or compromise. Reports about taxation, grain shortages, or diplomatic tension with France were delivered in long, cautious speeches, and Edward responded with short, firm commands. Foreign ambassadors observed this with a mixture of fascination and unease. They wrote that the boy listened with a composure unnatural for someone of such a tender age, and that his decisions were delivered with a precision that many seasoned rulers never achieved. He did not raise his voice. He did not fidget. He did not reveal insecurity. Instead, he corrected his ministers in a tone so calm that it bordered on chilling, as though every practical concern brought before him were nothing more than a small obstacle in the path of a divine mission he believed he had been born to fulfill. There was no softness in that composure, only certainty. A certainty shaped not by experience, but by design. To the council, this was disquieting. They had expected to guide a child. Instead, they found themselves speaking to someone who already believed he understood the structure and destiny of the kingdom better than any of them. Edward did not see discussion as exploration. He saw it as delay. He did not see disagreement as part of governance. He saw it as weakness. In those early days of his reign, the men around him still clung to the hope that time would soften him, that adolescence might loosen the rigidity that had been built into him. But each meeting, each command, each calm dismissal of their cautious advice, revealed the truth more clearly. Edward was not a child king being shaped by the council. He was a child king determined to shape the council and the country in the image he believed God had carved for him. And because he had never been taught to doubt himself, the idea of slowing down or reconsidering never crossed his mind. Under the reign of Edward VI, England entered a phase of religious transformation far faster and far harsher than anything seen under Henry VIII. What had once been incomplete or tentative now surged forward with a kind of fierce absolutism. Altars were torn down stone by stone, holy images were smashed. Painted saints that had watched over parish churches for centuries were ripped from the walls and discarded. Priests who refused to adopt the new Book of Common Prayer were seized and imprisoned. For local communities, none of this felt like simple liturgical change. It felt like the erasure of identity, the loss of traditions, memories, and sacred objects that had shaped their families for generations. But to Edward, all of this was merely necessary purification. He did not see the grief of the people. He saw only disobedience. Reports of unrest in rural parishes reached him in a steady stream, and they stirred not fear but indignation. He believed resistance was not directed at the crown, but at God. The most dramatic moment of this rising tension came with the prayer book rebellion of the year 1549, when the people of Devon and Cornwall rose together to demand the restoration of the Latin rites they had known all their lives. Edward read their petition with a steady, untroubled gaze. Then, in his journal, he wrote that such defiance required a sharp remedy. End of verse 6. The result was devastating. Hundreds of men, women, and even children died in the fields and lanes where the rebellion was crushed. To Edward, the bloodshed confirmed righteousness, proof, in his eyes, that divine favour rewarded firmness. To England, it revealed something far more unsettling. The boy on the throne did not see his subjects as suffering human beings, but as impurities to be removed. At the same time, the kingdom was unravelling under pressures that had nothing to do with doctrine. Inflation spread like a slow sickness. Harvests failed. Food grew scarce. In cottages across the country, families worried about how they would survive the coming winter. Yet while the people struggled to feed themselves, Edward demanded stricter enforcement of vagrancy laws. He viewed wandering beggars not as victims of economic collapse, but as moral failures needing discipline. His ministers tried, cautiously, to explain that wages were falling, that grain was scarce, that landlords were enclosing land, that hunger, not sin, was driving unrest. But Edward, shaped from infancy to believe obedience solved all things, dismissed these arguments. His worldview allowed no room for nuance. If people suffered, they should endure. If they complained, they rebelled. If they rebelled, they defied God. And so the gap widened. The gap between the religious idealism that guided the young king and the torn, struggling reality of the country he ruled. What Edward saw as divine purification, England experienced as chaos. What he understood as firmness, they felt as cruelty. What he believed was destiny, they recognized as the dangerous certainty of a child who had never been taught to question his own judgments. By the time those first years of reform had passed, one truth had settled like a long shadow across the kingdom. The foundations of Edward's rule were built on a faith so absolute that it left no space for humanity. Tensions spreading through the kingdom soon seeped upward into the highest levels of power, splitting the leadership into wary, competing factions. Somerset, the man who had once believed he could guide Edward, shape him, even protect him from the dangers of his own certainty, found himself steadily pushed to the margins. But the instability shaking the government did not come only from rivalry among nobles. It came from the king himself. Edward had begun to lose patience with anything resembling caution. To him, slow reform was not prudence. It was weakness. It was doubt. It was, in his eyes, a failure of faith. His journal from those years reveals a growing irritation with council members who urged moderation or delay. He wrote of their reluctance as though it were an obstacle, not advice as if they were barriers placed in the path of a divine mission, rather than stewards of a fragile kingdom recovering from decades of turmoil. In the mind of the boy king, he did not need protection. He needed speed. He needed obedience. He needed England to move exactly as he believed God intended. Foreign ambassadors, trained to observe even the subtlest shifts in a monarch's temperament, began sending home increasingly uneasy reports. They described Edward as an unsettling child, one whose seriousness felt too heavy for his age, whose face showed little emotional variation, whose conversation carried the tone of someone who believed every debate was settled before a single word had been spoken. Diplomats warned their governments that England was being steered by a boy whose certainty was dangerous not because he lacked experience, but because he lacked the ability to doubt himself. And as Edward pushed the country harder and faster, his body began showing the quiet, unmistakable signs of strain. He spent long hours at his desk, bent over parchment, reading reports, annotating margins, drafting instructions in a hand so neat it looked almost rigid. But to the servants who attended him daily, the transformation was clear. His complexion grew pale, almost translucent. His posture stiffened. His movements slowed. After certain coughing fits, he would sit frozen for several seconds, holding his breath as though waiting for the pain to ebb. Still, he did not stop. Edward had been raised to believe that discomfort was not a warning, but a test. That fatigue was not a limit, but an obstacle. That pushing through pain made him worthy of the destiny he believed he carried. In his mind, the strain on his body was simply another thing to conquer, another sign that the work he was doing mattered. He believed that if he could endure enough, insist enough, rule firmly enough, he could reshape England into the purified nation he imagined. And so he continued, hour after hour, day after day, ignoring the tightening in his chest, the trembling in his fingers, the breath he sometimes struggled to catch. But while the king pressed forward, the cracks beneath him widened, cracks in the council, cracks in the kingdom, and slowly, quietly, cracks in his own health. Each day, the gap between the speed of his ambition and the strength of his body stretched a little farther. Each night, the exhaustion he refused to acknowledge dug slightly deeper. The government grew nervous. The nobles whispered. And the servants, watching from the edges of power, saw what no one else wished to admit. The boy who was driving England with such relentless certainty was beginning to come apart. By the end of the year 1551, Edward's health had shifted quietly, almost imperceptibly from simple fatigue to something far more unsettling. Fevers began to visit him like unwelcome ghosts arriving suddenly, burning through his small frame, then fading, only to return with more strength than before. And every time a fever left him, it seemed to take a little more of him with it. His cheeks hollowed, his limbs thinned, his breath shortened. Yet he hid all of it behind a mask of discipline. He refused rest. He refused confinement. He refused the idea that illness had any claim over him. From his bed, wrapped in blankets that could not warm him, he demanded that documents be brought into his chamber. He insisted on continuing theological debates, struggling upright against pillows just to defend the reforms he believed England must follow. Even on days when his voice barely rose above a whisper, he expected the council to sit before him and listen. In his mind, the kingdom could not slow, and neither could he. The ministers began to fear what they saw, not only the deterioration of his body, but the sharpening intensity of his will. Their child king, once rigid, was becoming relentless. It was as though illness only confirmed what he had always believed, that he had been chosen for a divine mission, and that pain was simply proof that he must push harder. His diary reflected this shift with frightening clarity. What had once been crisp, measured entries became short, fragmented lines, urgent and breathless. Some passages looked less like royal record and more like a boy urging himself to keep going, to rise again, to endure. The handwriting trembled, the sentences thinned. The certainty remained, but it was now edged with desperation. Servants noticed stains on his nightclothes, thin streaks of dark red where he had coughed blood into the fabric. Physicians sighed heavily when they examined him, but when they met with the council they spoke with practiced calm, insisting the king would recover soon, that the symptoms were temporary, that rest would restore him. They lied, or perhaps they could not bear the truth themselves. Rumours slipped through the palace corridors like wind through cracked stone. That the king was so frail he had to be carried down the hall instead of walking. That trays of food were taken out of his chamber untouched. That when he spoke, his breath carried the sour, metallic scent of advanced consumption. No matter how the court tried to silence these whispers, they multiplied. The truth was difficult to hide when the centre of the kingdom was fading before their eyes. But Edward himself refused to acknowledge what was happening. He believed he was being tested, just as he had been taught since infancy. Every fever was a trial, every cough a challenge. Every night of breathless shivering, another opportunity to prove he was strong enough to complete the work he believed God had given him. Worse still, he convinced himself that he needed to accelerate reform before God tested him again. The kingdom did not know not yet how close the boy was to breaking. Edward did not know, or would not allow himself to know, that his test had already ended. This was not a trial. It was a collapse. By the beginning of the year 1552, every layer of pretense surrounding the king's condition had fallen away. The illusion of a boy merely unwell evaporated in a single moment, during a council meeting that would later be remembered with a quiet, uneasy dread. Edward suddenly gripped the edge of the table, his small knuckles whitening as his whole body trembled. Sweat poured down his face in a thin, shining sheet. His skin turned the color of ash. His breath came in a sharp, rasping hiss, the sound of lungs struggling against something tightening deep inside them, as though an invisible hand had closed around his chest. The meeting ended at once. Ministers rose in alarm. Servants rushed forward. Edward was carried from the chamber nearly unconscious, his eyelids fluttering like paper in a weak breeze. And from that day onward, the pattern of his illness changed. The fevers did not return gently. They crashed over him, one after another, each more brutal than the last. His cough grew violent, echoing through the palace corridors, with a force that made those who heard it pause mid-step. Some servants later admitted they would hold their breath until the sound stopped, as though afraid their own lungs might seize in sympathy. The bed linens beneath him were soaked so frequently with sweat and streaked with blood that they had to be changed daily, sometimes twice in a single night. Still, Edward issued orders. Still, he signed documents. But the signatures shook thin, broken lines skipping across the page, as if the pen itself resisted being held by hands so weak. His determination did not fade. It shifted into desperation. He believed he was running out of time. The idea that his body might fail before he completed what he believed to be God's work filled him with a quiet, urgent terror. He pushed himself harder. He tried to read even when his eyes blurred. He attempted to sit upright even when his ribs ached with every breath. Foreign ambassadors sent messages home describing the king as thin as a ghost. It was no longer a rumor. It was visible to anyone who saw him. The sharp angles of bone beneath translucent skin, the way his head sagged forward as though too heavy for his neck, the hollowness in his eyes. No one believed he would recover anymore. Inside the palace, the servants changed his sheets every morning, but nothing could lift the heavy scent that clung to the room, the sour smell of fever, the metallic edge of blood, the damp, earthy odor of lungs decaying from within. It was the smell of death approaching, slow but sure. The chamber felt sealed, suffocating, like a room wrapped tightly in the air of consumption. Heat pooled in the corners. The atmosphere pressed against the skin. Every breath Edward took seemed to thicken the air further. Servants brought trays of food into the room and removed them untouched. The sight became routine, and yet each time it happened, a quiet dread settled deeper over the palace. Physicians moved in and out with anxious ritual, massaging his chest, applying heated cloths, preparing mixtures of herbs meant to open the lungs. None of it worked. His breaths remained shallow, his coughs violent, his strength slipping away grain by grain. The palace understood, and still no one spoke it aloud. The boy was dying, and the kingdom could do nothing but watch. When the illness entered its final stage, no one in the palace believed the young king would survive the summer. His body had grown so frail, his breath so thin, that the Regency Council could no longer pretend hope. They were forced to place the device for the succession before him, the document meant to determine who would inherit the throne once he died. Edward trembled so violently that attendants had to hold his hand steady just to guide the pen. Even then, the signature came out crooked, broken, the uneven scrawl of someone slipping toward the edge of a cliff. Inside the suffocating chamber, sealed tight with shuttered windows to keep out drafts, Edward was dying hour by hour. The air was thick, almost wet, trapped by the constant burning of scented herbs meant to disguise the odor of decay. His breathing had become a wet, rattling hiss, as though his lungs were filling slowly with liquid. At times the sound grew so loud it spilled into the hallway, making even the guards standing outside straighten in unease. The coughing fits were the worst. Each one seized his entire body, folding him into spasms that shook the bed. Blood burst from his mouth in bright, terrible flecks, staining his pillows, streaking the cloth held to his lips. By the 6th day of July in the year 1553, his breaths had begun to falter. The rhythm that had carried him through 15 brief years started breaking apart. First came a long inhale, thin, trembling, strained. Then a heavy silence, one so deep the attendants felt their own hearts stop. Then a second breath, weaker, shorter. And then a third, barely lifting his chest at all. After that, nothing. No rise, no fall, only stillness. The boy once celebrated as the future of England died quietly, suffocating inside the body that had betrayed him not by treachery, not by poison, not by rebellion, but by the slow, merciless collapse of a child forced to live like a machine. His death was not dramatic. It was devastating in its quietness, its inevitability. The news spread through the palace like a cold wind. Conversations fell silent. Servants froze mid-step. Ministers stared at one another with dawning fear. Edward VI, only 15 years old, had left behind a kingdom unprepared for the storm that would follow. And he left behind a death far more harrowing, far more suffocating, than the softened stories history would later try to tell. After the death of Edward VI, the first thing people understood was not sorrow for a young king gone too soon, but the terrifying depth of the fractures his brief reign had carved into England. Though he ruled for only 6 years, Edward reshaped the kingdom's religious and political structure more forcefully than any Tudor monarch before him, even more forcefully than Henry VIII, whose decisions had shaken Europe. The first and sharpest wound was the religious transformation he accelerated. Under Edward, the Reformation shifted from in progress to irreversibly set. The changes he forced through the new rites, the destruction of altars, the stripping of images, the punishment of resistant clergy left the nation divided in ways that would erupt violently under Mary and whisper rebelliously under Elizabeth. Edward's certainty did not merely advance reform, it hardened it into a line that would split families, parishes, entire counties for decades. The second fracture lay within the aristocracy itself. The old noble class, the traditional backbone of Tudor governance, fractured under the pressure of Edward's uncompromising vision. The Regency Council, once confident they could guide the young king, found themselves pulled apart instead. Edward's rigidity intensified rivalries, sharpened suspicions, and turned caution into treason in his eyes. Factions grew. Alliances collapsed. What remained was a government weakened, disordered, and shaken by internal hostility. And then came the third, deepest rupture: succession. Edward's death hurled England into a political void. Mary, unwavering in her Catholic faith, stood ready to reverse everything her brother had built. Elizabeth, young, strategically silent, her beliefs still shadowed, represented a future no one could fully predict. And Lady Jane Grey, the girl Edward in his final days, tried to push onto the throne to preserve the Protestant world he had engineered, hovered at the edge of legitimacy, a fragile solution born from desperation. When Edward died, England did not simply lose a king. It lost its single thread of stability, the thread the Tudor dynasty had clung to for more than 2 turbulent decades. His reign, though short, revealed something the court had not wanted to see, that the entire Tudor structure rested on ground far more unstable than anyone was willing to admit. The certainty Edward projected had been a facade, a bright surface covering a nation cracking underneath. And when he was gone, those cracks widened, swallowing the illusion of unity that had held the kingdom together. In the silence that followed his passing, the truth settled over England like a heavy mist. A boy king, shaped into certainty, had left behind a country more uncertain than ever. In the bewilderment that followed his death, one question echoed through the corridors of the court, soft but relentless. Who was Edward, truly? Was he a cold young tyrant, a fervent reformer, or simply a child shaped into whatever the adults around him needed him to be? When one looks back over the full span of his short life, the answer emerges with haunting clarity. Edward was never permitted to become a normal human being. From the moment he entered the world, he was wrapped not in warmth or ordinary affection, but in fear, expectation, and reverence. And because of that, he was denied the 2 freedoms every child needs to grow into themselves: the freedom to make mistakes, and the freedom to discover who they truly are. Every person who stepped into his life did so carrying an agenda, political, religious, or personal. No one asked him what he felt, what he wondered, what confused him. They asked whether he aligned with the direction of England. They watched him as a symbol, not a boy. He had no friends, no unguarded laughter, no careless afternoons that teach a child the softness of being young. What he had instead was surveillance, expectation, and a destiny placed on him before he could form memories. And so his sense of self developed strangely fragile yet absolute, hollow yet rigid. He became someone who could not doubt himself, because he had never been allowed the kind of life where doubt is safe. His cold commands at 12 years old, his insistence on harsh reforms, his unwavering certainty, all of it was the product of a child who had never met the real world. Only the hopes and fears projected onto him by adults. When illness came, he did not understand rest. He did not understand retreat. He did not understand that stepping back is sometimes the only way to survive. He had been taught since infancy that pain was part of duty, that endurance was proof of worthiness, that weakness was failure. He believed that if his body hurt, he should push harder. If he was exhausted, he should fight more fiercely. That belief planted in him by the adults who shaped him became the quiet force that sealed his fate. In the end, it was not rebellion or treachery or politics that killed Edward VI. It was the absence of a childhood, the absence of permission to be human, the absence of anyone who ever told him he was allowed to stop. Perhaps the most piercing truth, when one looks back at the life of Edward VI, is the absoluteness that governed every corner of his mind. In his inner world, everything existed in pairs of opposites, right or wrong, order or chaos, sacred or wicked. There were no grey spaces between those extremes, no room for uncertainty, hesitation, or empathy. He did not understand disagreement as dialogue. He understood it as defiance. He did not recognize the suffering of others as human pain. He saw it as weakness. But what made that absoluteness truly frightening was this. It was not something he created. It was something planted in him. From the moment he lay in his cradle, the messages around him carried a single tone, the severe lessons of Protestant theology, the reverence of courtiers who bowed too deeply, spoke too gently, and feared too openly, the obsession of Henry VIII, who believed the birth of a son was divine compensation for the sins of the kingdom. All of these threads wrapped around Edward like a cocoon, teaching him that he was chosen, that he was responsible for finishing a sacred mission no one else could complete. And when a child is raised to believe he is an instrument of God, he no longer sees other people as people. He sees them as interruptions. He sees their hurt as weakness. He sees their disagreement as blasphemy. He sees their fear as defiance. This absolute way of thinking did not only fracture the country, it slowly consumed Edward himself. The harsher he pushed his reforms, the harder he pushed his body. Every cough, every fever, every sleepless night became in his mind a divine exam. He believed he had to pass it. He believed pain meant God was watching. He believed endurance meant he was proving his worth. But his body, thin, fragile, overworked, was never built to carry the burden of a grown man, much less the burden of an entire kingdom. He pushed himself as though he were invincible. He forced himself forward as though mission alone could keep him alive. And in the end, that absoluteness became his tragedy. He died still believing he had more to do. He died thinking he had not yet fulfilled the task placed upon him. He died convinced that God was waiting for him to rise again and continue. A child who was never allowed to question, never allowed to bend, never allowed to be human, died under the weight of a destiny he never chose. For centuries, the death of Edward VI was wrapped in soft, gentle phrases, a cold, a weakness of the lungs, a peaceful passing, a story polished smooth so it would not sting. But the truth, like so many truths of the Tudor world, was far more brutal. The court worked tirelessly to soften the horror of his final days, not out of compassion, but to protect the dignity of the crown. They did not want the world to know that the chamber of the young king had turned into a suffocating vault, that his ragged, rattling breaths could be heard from the corridor, that every coughing fit sent blood and fluid spraying from his failing lungs. They did not want whispered abroad that his body had wasted down to skin stretched thin over bone, or that his final breaths had the terrible sound of someone drowning inside their own chest. Most of all, they did not want to admit the truth that lay beneath the tragedy. Edward's collapse was the direct consequence of the very system that created him. England had placed too many hopes on a single child, pressed too many dreams, too many fears, too many demands onto a frame far too small to bear them. The court shaped him not as a human being but as an instrument. They forged him into a symbol, a vessel, a solution to problems that long predated him. And in doing so, they ignored the boy who lived inside the body of a king, a boy whose health had always been fragile, whose strength was never enough to carry the burden of a nation still trembling from decades of upheaval. The truth is simple and devastating. Edward did not die merely from illness. He died from expectation. He died from the weight of a throne that crushed him long before disease ever reached his lungs. He died because no one around him could imagine a future that did not depend on him being more than he was a child. His death was not just the end of a young monarch. It was the death of an illusion. The illusion that a fragile boy could save a fractured kingdom, that destiny alone could hold together a country already splintering at its core, that shaping a child into a symbol could ever end in anything but heartbreak. Edward VI did not simply fail England. England failed him. When one looks back over the whole journey of Edward VI, the tragedy that rises to the surface is not the shortness of his reign, nor the religious divisions he intensified, but the simple, devastating fact that he never lived a life that belonged to himself. Edward did not choose to be born in a palace. He did not choose to become the hope of an entire kingdom. He did not choose to be the target of political ambition or religious desperation. He did not choose to be shaped into a symbol. He was just a child, yet everyone around him behaved as if he were a walking prophecy, and children treated like symbols always pay a price. Edward's coldness, his rigidity, his fervour were not his nature. They were the consequences of an environment designed with no room for softness, no room for hesitation, no room for human vulnerability. His world allowed no space for fear, no place for doubt, no permission to rest, and certainly no path toward a gentle, long life. When Edward died at the age of 15 alone, suffocating, trapped in the blistering heat and sour smell of a sealed sick room, it was more than the death of a young king. It was a harsh reminder of a truth kingdoms rarely want to face. A nation can destroy its own hope by placing too much weight on the shoulders of a child. Edward VI was not a tyrant. He was not a prodigy. He was not even a singular victim. He was proof of a deeper, quieter truth. When a child is raised not to become a person, but to become a savior, the story can only end as his did. In exhaustion, in collapse, in tragedy,